So I'm Catherine Flynn. I have been sitting listening to people already, and I was just really struck by the importance of days like this that bring together lived, learned, practice and research experience, and just the real importance of connecting with your people, right? I was really also struck by the panel and some things that we're going to pick up, but the panel really kind of, in lots of different ways, kind of emphasising the need for the AOD sector to bring an intersectional lens and for AOD to work and play better, I guess, with people in other sectors. And so that's definitely something we're going to pick up on. As Lisa very kindly said, this was a project. I'm the support act. You'll get kind of 5 minutes of me and then I'm gone. This is really Abbie's project that she did as part of her final year of the master's program. Oh, you're going to click for me. Okay, thank you. Like other people, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I work and on which this project was done, which is the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations. Pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend those respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here today.
Okay, I
was going to do the first bit and then sit down and get out of your way. That's easy for me, right? This is just really a quick word on terminology and language when we're talking about who we're talking about, like the idea of kind of a female forensic AOD client. Really, we're just talking, as Lisa said, about women who are mandated to AOD treatment. So we're not talking about women in prison, though there are clearly some connections across that. So a couple of starting words. So this research is all about practice. So what we do, how we do it, and how to make sure that what we do meets the needs of the people that we're working with. And while I have kind of a captive audience, I'm going to, actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go to, no, I'm not going to go there. I would just like to have people indulge me for like 1 minute to talk about another piece of practice research that I'm involved in. And I don't have any flyers about it, I don't have any details, but if people want to catch me during the break or at lunchtime, please do. It's also a piece of research that we're doing with some colleagues in New South Wales, but also with Windana. And again, this idea of intersectionality, this project came out of practice observations a number of years ago about young women who go missing, but who pop up then, perhaps unsurprisingly to people in the room, but pop up again in the criminal justice system. And really trying to work out, well, how do we divert that? How do we stop that from happening? And so this project is really focused on that. And if in your work or in your lives you know any women who've had involvement with the legal system and have experienced running away or going missing when they were children, well, 10 to 17, it's quite a niche group, but please come and have a chat to me about it. I'm really happy to do that. I wasn't going to do the sales pitch today, and I was saying to Lisa when I came in, the reason I decided to do the sales pitch was, as I got on the train to come today, there was a missing poster at the train station for this 15-year-old kid called Isla, who hasn't been seen in a couple of weeks. And it just kind of really brought home to me that these are not academic matters. These are matters of people's lives. And if we can do something as researchers and as practitioners to make a difference, then we should do that. So, sales pitch done. This particular project is absolutely a collaboration between task force part of Windana and the social work department at Monash. And it came about absolutely because of observations from practice about the disconnect between the needs of women presenting and this kind of one-size-fits-all approach. And even where, you know, the service delivery model says, you know, you need to tailor your services for women, nobody actually really tells you how to do that. Like, there are all those big words that float around about, you know, trauma-informed and best practice, but often we're left to make sense of that ourselves. And so this project is really about trying to kind of drill down and work out, well, what are the needs and of this particular group and what are the best practices? What we know, well, we know a bit about women in the justice system, and we've known that for a while. And Teresa spoke about that quite eloquently earlier on about, you know, from the probably 70s and the 80s, feminist criminologists. I'm old enough and have been working for long enough to remember that it was in 2005 that the first sort of gender responsive policy for women in the justice system was released. So we've got this some understanding, and I'm definitely not saying that's completely, we're on top of it and it's all good, but there's some understanding of gender in the criminal justice system. So we know a bit about women in the justice system. We know a bit about women who are engaged in AOD treatment voluntarily, but we don't know a lot about that sort of intersecting point. And we make some assumptions about that. And this project has really been all about working out, are there additional complexities? What are those needs? And how do we best respond to that? So as part of kind of getting sorted for that and setting the study up, we had to kind of consider, well, what do we know already? Because there's no point reinventing the wheel. So there's very little, again, this might not surprise people here, but there's very little specific about women who are mandated to AOD treatment. So having to look at that AOD literature more generally. And there were kind of 5 main themes that came out in that literature. And they may, in fact, resonate with some of your own observations or wonderings about practice. So the first point is obviously that what we know about women in particular is a bit of an approximation, and particularly what we know about women who are mandated to treatment is an approximation, because often in research we kind of pop things together because it's convenient sometimes. So often women who are, you know, voluntary service users versus mandated service users, we'll put them together, or even male and female clients. So we don't know anything particularly specific about this group. What we do know about women, and this will definitely not surprise anyone in this room, is the comorbidity of trauma. It's kind of bread and butter for what we do every day, I think. But what we don't know about is, well, it's lovely to go, okay, well, we know people have that history, but what does that really mean in terms of how we engage with people? What does it mean in terms of any barriers to engagement with treatment, particularly when that treatment is mandated? What else do we know? We know a little bit about what gets in the way of treatment for people. We know, and people, the panel were talking about this before, about those gendered barriers. Things like childcare, caring responsibilities, sometimes even other people acting as barriers to treatment. Interestingly, we know that women make up less than 1/3 of service users in AOD treatment, but I don't think anyone assumes that women have less challenges with AOD. So there are definitely things getting in the way. Again, a bit reflecting the panel, we know that there are some things that help, particularly social connection, and particularly those pro-social relationships. We also know a little bit about what's needed and the need for a non-punitive approach. Again, I feel like I'm preaching to the converted already, but the need for a non-punitive approach in terms of service delivery and an advocacy model for public health responses to AOD. I'm now going to hand over to you, and Abbie's going to talk really much more about the study.
Okay, so this study was a mixed method study. So we used both semi-structured interviews with clinicians at Task Force Windana, as well as a case file analysis of past clients at the service. For the forensic AOD clinicians, we had 4 clinicians from the adult space, 2 from the youth. There was no strict sort of recruitment sort of characteristics. It was just people who had worked in the forensic AOD system with both men and women. And then for the case file analysis, it was an extreme case sampling. So we actually had 6 positive outcome case files and 6 negative outcome case files. So to define a positive outcome, it was just sort of people who had pretty much completed treatment. That's obviously a positive outcome in itself, so that was quite easy to define. But in terms of the negative outcomes, it was sort of more low engagement or suddenly sort of ceasing engagement. From the files, what we had, we tried to sort of map the trajectory through the forensic AOD system. So we took their intake treatment summary and also closure summary, just to sort of map that experience. Through doing the extreme case sampling, we wanted to sort of platform a voice that often is missed in research by looking at people who didn't necessarily achieve the a positive outcome. That was platforming a voice that isn't as dominant in research, because we often hear about more people who have experienced positive outcomes. So in terms of the findings, so the findings are based off responses to the interviews and also a case file analysis that sort of picked up on themes across both. So we looked at points of contention and also agreements or consensus among the interviews, as well as the thematic sort of analysis of the case files to pick up on present themes. So with the clinicians, all had qualifications and experience that reflected the dual diagnosed nature of people in the forensic AOD system. So they often had qualifications in both AOD and mental health. Experience varied, so there was, it was from 1 to 16 years experience in the sector. And then in terms of the case files, so all 12 case files had mental health diagnoses. The 6 positive case files had diagnoses of depression and anxiety. All negative outcome case files had diagnosed trauma disorders, so PTSD and BPD. All negative, and also with the positive case files, there was a more diverse primary substance that was used by the client, so cocaine, alcohol, prescribed opioids and methamphetamine. But then when looking at the negative outcome, we had the diagnosed trauma disorders and all had methamphetamine as their primary substance of use. So in terms of the themes that were picked up from the interviews and the case files was the dual diagnosis with a gendered lens. So we know that mental health isn't unique to females engaging with the forensic AOD system. However, it's the type of mental health that they're experiencing. So these are just some quotes from some of the responses. So we had men present with less diagnosed trauma, probably more ADHD with males. Mental health, that they've observed a lot of trauma and borderline personality disorder among female service users. Another distinction, so obviously when we're looking at men and women, the clinicians sort of acknowledge that trauma isn't unique to male or female service users. However, it was the type of trauma and the duration in which the trauma was occurring. So they agreed that women actually experience the trauma sort of throughout the lifespan and often co-occurring with treatment, whereas with male clients, they found that trauma was experienced in childhood and may not necessarily be occurring alongside treatment. The type of trauma as well experienced by women was different. So we had high prevalence of sexual abuse and family violence that occurred throughout the lifespan. We've got some quotes here. So victimisation, family violence and sexual violence. Underlying trauma, that's the background that women are presenting with. So that's the main difference present, was that they were presenting more with victims of abuse. And then another quote here, that she had a client that was coming in for a whole year that was presenting with like physical signs of violence. Another key difference that was pointed out by the clinicians was actually the presence of substance use as a form of control and abuse. So, two clinicians described this as a way of adding even more complexity to forensic female AOD clients. So the pressure to continue with using drugs or alcohol, because the consequences of not doing so might implement a risk either in terms of abuse or being killed. This would certainly drive that ongoing substance use. Another key difference as well that was raised in the interviews was that the child rearing responsibilities that we've sort of touched on already today. So if we look here, so they'll often hold the majority of the burden to work through things such as child protection orders, whereas men don't have, they were saying that it was far less likely for men to hold that responsibility. And then, so Eva, this clinician also said that it's easy for clients to sort of get swept up in that, and it can sort of detract from them acknowledging and addressing their substance use. So, mandatory AOD treatment, is it meeting the needs, women's needs? Four of the adult clinicians working in the adult sector agreed that it was harder to engage forensic clients compared to voluntary clients. And they also highlighted the disadvantages present among mandated clients. So barriers such as public transport or losing their licence, a loss of income and employment. All clinicians, bar one, agreed that the system is too punitive, despite it being less so than it was in the past. However, both youth clinicians actually felt that the system did well to engage their clients, and they largely attributed this to more flexible ways of engaging clients. So, best practice, what we're seeking to sort of understand a little bit more about with this study. All clinicians found that this term of best practice was sort of hard to grapple with and hard to define. A lot of them focused on micro practices, so needs-based approach, motivational interviewing, cognitive behavioural therapy, harm minimisation, and a trauma-informed approach. And then when asked what enabled best practice, all clinicians described sort of organisational responsibilities, so regular supervision, ongoing training and professional development, so that they were implementing evidence-based interventions. And then barriers to best practice, these were like the macro sort of system level barriers, so approaches that were too punitive, and abstinence-based approach as well to treatment, and also limited resources. So when we look at the positive case files, all of them actually had external motivators. So if we look, we've got case files 8 and 10, so they were focused on obtaining and maintaining employment. Case file 11, they wanted to get to a point where they could go to a rehabilitation centre. Case file 12 wanted her son to be proud of her and to travel with him. Case file 7 was also in the process of trying to secure private rental. And case file 9, there was no external motivator. However, her clinician did stipulate that she was quite onto engaging in the regular homework that was assigned to her. So what is uncovered here when we're looking at positive case files is that connection to community, whether that be through work, friends, family or activities, would be a core component of best practice. So the needs that stem from the findings is that a trauma-based mental health, the chronic way in which women experience trauma through the lifespan and the type of trauma, as well as child rearing responsibilities, are all really unique needs to women in the forensic AOD system. And they also need to be considered if we are going to be working in a way that is best practice. Another key finding is that best practice needs to be sort of like a systems level approach, because if it's not upheld firstly by the macro, the meso, then it is hard for a clinician to be engaging in best practice. Okay, so what does it all mean? So when working with female forensic AOD clients, there are specific gender-based risk factors. So the prevalence of abuse and trauma victimisation, this is a gender-based risk factor that needs to be considered because this could be co-occurring alongside treatment. Family violence and forced substance use, So ongoing substance use fueled by coercion adds another level of complexity. Trauma-based mental health, so PTSD and BPD. Existing literature does acknowledge the sort of dual diagnosis nature of people accessing the forensic AOD system. However, the gendered lens on what types of mental health women are experiencing is sort of missing from existing literature. And then capturing client risk in documentation. So unless clinicians are sort of prompted to have this lens, it won't be a cohesive sort of approach to upholding best practice, because it will be inconsistent across the service sector. So another theme was around the pro-social connections, barriers and disadvantages. So the clinicians sort of have placed more of an emphasis on the impact of negative social connections, so that kind of alluded to the importance of pro-social connections. And also this was in line with existing literature, because it also echoed this when people were able to achieve recovery, they were connected to community and pro-social connections. Some of the literature actually did suggest that there was little difference between mandated and voluntary clients. However, we know by some of the barriers that were outlined in the findings that there is extreme disadvantage associated with being a mandated client. And often loss of employment and income can further entrench them in poverty-driven crime, which means that that's just an ongoing cycle in remaining within the justice system. So women and child-rearing responsibilities. Is it a hindrance to treatment, or is it a motivator to complete treatment? So some clinicians did sort of pose that it is a barrier to treatment. However, when we actually looked at some studies that had been done, and even at the case files, we actually had women that were asking for more flexibility so that they could fulfil both child rearing and AOD, forensic AOD treatment obligations. So in one of the studies that we did look at, there was a woman that wanted just some toys in the waiting room so that her child didn't get too impatient while she was waiting. And then in one of the case files, one of them had asked their clinician if they could do telehealth appointments because they're a single mother of 4. So, best practice. So interventions need to be considered across the macro, meso and the micro. So without the targeted and specific research into this cohort of women accessing treatment under a CCO or under the sort of mandated system, there isn't going to be a service response that is engaged in evidence-based interventions, because the research isn't there to inform the right policies. And the sort of relative invisibility of women accessing treatment in the forensic system definitely contributes to a service response that isn't going to address their needs. So, implications for practice. I was actually quite glad going after the lived experience panel, because I did touch on a more integrated service system. There just isn't the sort of integration between recognising some of the signs of family violence that women may be experiencing. And forensic AOD clinicians are actually in a really unique position, because males who are engaging in the forensic AOD system are also more highly likely to be perpetrating family violence than the general population. So if they're trained in a way of identifying these patterns of abuse, then they can also redirect male service users to more appropriate services like men's behaviour change. Gender-specific risk factors is a really important part. This really needs to be captured in documentation. At the moment, when looking at the intake and closure summaries, a big part of whether a woman was at risk of family violence was just asking whether there was an IVO in place. So if we're not able to assess risk around the co-occurring abuse and victimisation alongside treatment, unless the clinicians are coming, I'm sure all of you might when you're actually in work now, be able to think about this, but if you're not prompted to do it as an actual procedure, it can be missed and inconsistent. There we go. The sign just came up too.